Now, several days back at this point, Deborah Chow was asked in an interview about how the upcoming Kenobi series, which she is the director of, how it would look at or handle some of the original lines between Vader and Obi-Wan from A New Hope, mainly this famous one said by Darth Vader right before their duel in that film.
I've been waiting for you, Obi-Wan. We meet again at last. The circle is now complete. When I left you, I was but the learner. Now I am the master.
And her response, after saying it was all something they were definitely mindful of, was to say that it's an honor to take these characters and to be able to tell a new story with them. So I wanted to be very respectful to what exists and not change anything that George intended originally or anything like that. Which, as someone who considers themselves a bit of a George Lucas purist, in my opinion that's a very good answer and brings on a bit of a momentary sigh of relief to hear that respecting what Lucas originally intended is very important, that they don't want to change anything, she said. But then she goes on to say this shortly thereafter. Obviously, there is room for interpretation here, and telling the story that they did have these 20 years, and obviously something happened in these 20 years, and that there are some things from our series where there's going to be a little bit more room for interpretation on. Okay, and before getting further into this, I do want to say that I have a lot of confidence in Deborah Chow. She seems to know her stuff when it comes to Star Wars and has directed some great episodes of The Mandalorian. And I have a lot of hope for Kenobi overall. I desperately want this to be good and something that almost all fans of Star Wars can enjoy to avoid another battle in the fan base. However, I can't help but point out that initially it feels like there is a contradiction in her words here, that in one breath she says they don't want to change anything Lucas intended, but then in the next she says things are open to interpretation or there is room for interpretation. Because as I see it, you're either trying to decipher what Lucas intended with what was said in those films by the characters and then stay as true to that as possible, or you're looking for flexibility to interpret it a different way, to do your own thing or to put your own spin on it. And in this case, doing their own thing is, as we've been all but guaranteed, is going to happen in the series. It's another duel between Vader and Kenobi set between episodes 3 and 4. So basically the question here is, did Lucas intend or imply there would be another encounter between these two characters, between Vader and Kenobi? Or are they trying to squeeze one in that doesn't align with what was intended, just for the sake of having another duel to help sell the series and thus sell Disney Plus subscriptions? And so what I'm going to do in this video, for fun but seriously within the context of Star Wars and trying to be as fair and objective as possible, is I'm going to go over every scene in A New Hope that has anything to do with a history between Vader and Kenobi, or that could suggest there was or wasn't a third duel between them, one that again was set squarely between the other two duels we've already seen. Essentially, we're going to try and decipher what Lucas originally intended, if we can. And I say if we can because when you really stop and analyze it, like we're about to, you'll find it's not quite as straightforward or easy to figure out as you might think or want to believe it is. And so getting right to it, we'll start with these lines from Obi-Wan to Luke pretty early in the film.
How did my father die?
A young Jedi named Darth Vader, who was a pupil of mine until he turned to evil, helped the Empire hunt down and destroy the Jedi Knights.
Alright, so one thing to keep in mind right away here is that when this film was made, when A New Hope, or just Star Wars as it was called way back in the day, when it was written and created and when it came out, it was not yet decided that Vader and Anakin were one and the same. Instead, Luke's father was indeed supposed to have been killed, literally killed, by a pupil of Obi-Wan's named Darth Vader. That was meant to be his actual name, not some sort of title or Sith name given to him by the Emperor after he ceased being Anakin Skywalker, and so on. And then later on in this film, Obi-Wan even calls him Darth like it's his first name.
Only a master of evil, Darth.
Though we can always just, now after the fact, kind of construe this as Obi-Wan sort of being a little tongue-in-cheek or kind of mocking him and calling him Darth. Another problem we sort of run into here is that there's another way that this doesn't exactly make sense when you try to align it with everything else we know or that we would see later, that being Darth Vader, or Anakin, wasn't a pupil of Obi-Wan's until he turned to evil. He stopped being his pupil and became a full-fledged Jedi Knight long before his turn to the dark side. We know this thanks to, of course, the prequels and the Clone Wars animated series. However, I'd say this is a minor problem and could just easily be overlooked or looked at as Obi-Wan kind of wording it oddly. Or we could just chalk it up to the explanation he'd give Luke later on in Return of the Jedi that everything he told him here was true from a certain point of view. And mainly, I just wanted to bring this up not because it's a big deal in and of itself, but because it relates to a line later on in the film. The next scene or line we move to is when the Millennium Falcon is caught in the tractor beam, brought aboard the Death Star, and Vader comes to the hangar bay, senses Kenobi, and says this.
Send a scanning crew aboard. I want every part of this ship checked.
Yes, sir.
I sense something. A presence I've not felt since...
And here, of course, there is a ton of room for interpretation because he just leaves his words hanging. Vader could mean it's a presence he hasn't felt since, technically, yesterday, or it could be not since Mustafar, or he could, of course, mean it's a presence he hasn't felt since that other time they dueled after Mustafar, the one that will, again, almost certainly take place in the Kenobi series. It could also be another time entirely that he sensed Kenobi. He also says the word presence, which means some way, somehow, he could have sensed Kenobi at some other point along the way through the Force and not physically encountered him. I suppose they could have even had some sort of Force vision duel against each other this way. And yes, something like this is possible because the bond between master and apprentice forever remains strong, even if one happens to fall to the dark side. We learn this in the Clone Wars when Sidious is able to connect and battle Yoda in a sort of Force vision, thanks to the help of Dooku, who was, of course, once an apprentice to Yoda. So it could be that at some point in the previous 20 years, or at multiple points even, Vader has reached out through the Force to see if he could sense his former master, and has sensed him at least once, or has felt his presence through the Force. And so what Vader could be saying here is that it's a presence he hasn't felt since that one time he reached out through the Force, and he felt Obi-Wan, and maybe that time they had a epic kind of Force vision duel against each other. Though what might just be even more curious or noteworthy about this scene is that one would think that Vader, after sensing Kenobi is on the Millennium Falcon, or seems to be, that he wouldn't have left it all to a scanning crew to find him, that he would have immediately gotten on board the Falcon and began to hack the ship apart with a lightsaber, looking for Kenobi. Instead, he not only actually leaves the hangar altogether, but only leaves a handful of stormtroopers behind to guard the ship that Obi-Wan Kenobi is on, and he's got to know Kenobi is not going to have a whole lot of trouble with a few stormtroopers. And so, in all honesty here, this is something that now, well after the fact, after we've learned a lot about these characters, after we've seen the Battle of Mustafar, and we've heard Anakin scream at Obi-Wan how much he hates him, this is something that maybe doesn't make a ton of sense either. I mean, it just feels like there's no way this is how Vader would handle the situation. This is how he would handle Kenobi hiding away on a ship that was docked right in front of him. He'd be instead the one to deal with it himself.
No. Leave them to me. I will deal with them myself.
And so you could say, yet again here, that we have to kind of make concessions or understand that since the movie was made first and before the whole story was figured out by George Lucas, it's not always going to make total and complete sense or line up perfectly with everything else. Which does, you could argue, score a point for Deborah Chow saying some of this is open to interpretation because we already have to try to interpret or make sense of some of the known inconsistencies between this film and, say, the prequels. And I say that as someone who doesn't think, and in time will all but prove, I believe, that Lucas very much implied there is no other fight between these two, or never intended for there to be one. And so moving along here, we then have this scene or exchange between Vader and Tarkin to look at.
He is here.
Obi-Wan Kenobi. What makes you think so?
A tremor in the Force. The last time I felt it was in the presence of my old master.
Surely he must be dead by now.
Don't underestimate the Force.
So first of all, it's interesting to point out that we know from the scene that Tarkin knows that Vader used to be Anakin Skywalker, or Vader just admitted it to him, because Vader flat out says the last time he sensed this presence was in the presence of his former master, and since we know he's talking about Kenobi, that obviously means Tarkin could put two and two together here and figure out that this is Anakin Skywalker talking about the last time he sensed his master, Obi-Wan Kenobi. But anyway, the one thing here that is really kind of important is that Tarkin basically says that surely Kenobi must be dead by now, which to me implies that Tarkin has not heard anything about Kenobi in the previous 20 years or since the events of Revenge of the Sith, right? That he didn't hear about him resurfacing and then disappearing again roughly 10 years prior to this, or he might assume he was still alive at this point. And so to me, it certainly says that Tarkin didn't hear about some sort of encounter between Vader or Kenobi 10 years prior to this. Otherwise, he might assume Kenobi was still alive unless Vader had said he was dead. Unless, of course, Vader and the Inquisitors just kept the whole thing with Kenobi a secret, because perhaps Vader did indeed, or we know he did indeed, fail to kill Kenobi and didn't want that to be known by anyone, or it could just be something that Tarkin was never made aware of. And along these same lines, to briefly shift from A New Hope to Rebels, it's interesting to point out that in that show, Palpatine at one point, after Vader says he is still kind of looking for Kenobi, Palpatine says if he still lives, which tends to imply that if there is some sort of second encounter, Palpatine didn't seem to know about it either. But anyway, moving back to A New Hope, let's get back to this line.
I've been waiting for you, Obi-Wan. We meet again at last. The circle is now complete. When I left you, I was but the learner. Now I am the master.
Okay, so if you're trying to put this all together and decipher what George Lucas meant at the time, I think it's clear from these lines that he never intended for there to be an in-between fight for these two characters. Now, how can I say that with such confidence? Well, if we go back to what Obi-Wan said to Luke before, that Vader was a pupil of his till he turned to evil, and consider what Vader says here, that he was a learner when he left, well, the simple answer is, originally in the mind of George Lucas, Vader was indeed a student of Obi-Wan's up until the very moment he turned to the dark side, and that was the last time they saw each other. That's why he says, when I left you, I was but the learner. It's pretty straightforward in my opinion. Problem is, as pointed out before, that doesn't make a ton of sense when you look at what we learned in the prequels, that Anakin was not Obi-Wan's pupil when he turned to the dark side. He was already, again, a fully fledged Jedi Knight, and even one that was on the Jedi Council, though not granted the rank of Master, which here after the fact is probably the best way to try and decipher this line or make sense of it in the larger continuity. That what Vader is saying here is that when he left the Jedi and when he left Obi-Wan along with them, he was considered a learner because they wouldn't grant him the rank of Master. He's making mention of this slight against him, or a perceived slight against him. And in a roundabout way, he's saying how this slight was all part of the reason he stopped trusting the Jedi, that they only put him on the council at the behest of Palpatine, so that he would turn around and spy on Palpatine for them. That would then mean, if we want to look at it this way, it would still kind of imply no meeting between the two since Mustafar, because he's referring to when he wasn't granted the rank of Master by saying he was a learner, and so, again, we don't have room for another duel between the two of them. Yet another way we could look at this, though I think this one is a bit more of a stretch, is that when Vader says he was a learner when he left, he is referring to another duel between them, where Vader, as a Sith in the suit and everything, he was still learning the ways of the dark side, I guess. I just have a hard time believing someone who made a fuss about not being a master would then call himself a learner. But it could be construed to refer to, yes, another duel. This one we'll see in Kenobi. But in all honesty, I do think making this refer to being snubbed as a master by the Jedi makes more sense, or just fits much cleaner into the whole continuity. Either way, no matter how we look at it, this line taken completely at face value or as is doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It does need some level of interpretation to fit in with the rest of the story that we know. Though originally, and looked at just in the context of A New Hope, it basically does say that Kenobi and Vader have not encountered each other since whatever happened that turned Vader to the dark side, since he was a pupil of Obi-Wan's, keeping in mind that Vader and Anakin again weren't considered to be one and the same yet, or in this movie. So in conclusion, if you're trying to strictly decipher what Lucas was intending, I do think it's pretty clear that at the time he was saying Vader and Kenobi only meet the 2 times and that is it. However, you could argue that Lucas himself does change things or change his mind in order to make the story better than what it was before. I think we all will agree that making Anakin and Vader one and the same does tremendous things for the story of Star Wars, and it wouldn't be the same if he hadn't. So does that justify someone else, someone besides Lucas, coming in and making changes to a pretty significant part or a central part of the story, changing it from what he originally intended in order to potentially make for a better story? Well, the answer to that question is it's up for you to personally answer that for yourself, though I think I've laid out my argument here that there isn't technically room for one as it stands in the context of A New Hope. Plus, we do have to see, of course, how it will be handled in the actual series, assuming that, yes, they will indeed encounter each other as has been pretty heavily implied at this point. So we can only hope it will be handled extremely well, and that somehow it'll indeed respect what Lucas intended, while departing from what he intended. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me how you decipher all these lines from A New Hope. Does it imply there was only ever supposed to be one fight between them, or the two, the one we see on Mustafar and the one we see on the Death Star? Or is the door open for another? Whatever you think, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.